Uh, Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's webinar. And this week we're going to look into remote teams and working across time zones and the challenges and opportunities that this entails. And so someone asked me about this and the context for why we're looking at this. Someone asked me about this, and I realized I'd only done this very, very briefly, and I didn't really have like great experience. So the first person I thought of when I thought of someone who I could ask was Elan, because Elan has been managing a pure remote, multi-time zone team now, which spans from, I think, Central European time to Pacific time for a number of years now. So that's why we brought Elan in. Great to have you, Elan.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I should say there's also we have one awesome analyst in New Zealand. So
Oh
so
wow, that's the
it's
whole world.
truly global. It's truly global. And yeah, she's great. But yeah, the majority of the team would go from like kind of Pacific coast of the of North America through to Central European.
Cool. So I think we shared some questions and we've already been given some extra additional questions, but so let's make a start because we're probably going to be short on time. Um, First question, what are the main difficulties involved in managing a data team across time zones and geographies?
It's a great question. Um, I think the biggest challenge is ensuring that everybody feels part of a team. There's a lot of micro challenges, and I'm going to outline a couple, but the biggest one is just kind of ensuring that folks are, feel that they're part of a team's kind of a coherent unit. Um, the other, consideration I would say, kind of overarching is being very intentional and explicit with everything you do and how you communicate. So I'll give you a couple examples. Um, it's very common to say, "Hey, I'll get to this by the end of the day." Okay, well, what does that mean for you? So being very explicit that end of day is, for example, 5 p.m. I'll, I'll get this done by 5 p.m. Eastern time, and then they can orient around that. And then that also sets the expectation on their part that they need to be explicit with you. And folks shouldn't assume, oh, if you're in the UK, then your end of day is at noon for me. So I no, just tell me what that is. Um, being explicit around your calendar. So we have shared Google Calendar at Brooklyn Data, and really just like outlining like here are my working hours. You know, they might not be 9 to 5. They might not be your 9 to 5 or my 9 to 5. They might be 10 to 7. They might be whatever they happen to be. Um, so being very explicit there, and also being explicit in your calendar with things like, you know, for example, I do drop off for my kids in the morning, so kind of blocking that time off, so it's the kind of non-negotiable time. Just don't book anything there. So little stuff like that, just being kind of going out of your way. So setting norms are really critical as well. So at Brooklyn Day we have a lot of norms around our Zoom and our Slack and meetings and documentation. So it kind of transcends time zone, but I think setting norms are really critical. We also like to leverage technology. Um, so some things that we do, Slack has this. I don't know if y'all use Slack, but this donut app, which we use. Yeah, so it's kind of like just social time, shoot shoot the breeze, talk about whatever. Um, and something that when I worked in a physical office, never did that because you just turn to your right, turn to your left, and you just talk to the individual. Um, so all these little things. We've also set up. So again, like coming back to how do you make sure that the team feels that everybody feels like they're part of a team. Um, we have community resource groups, which are great, so people can opt into kind of that community that they want to grow into and be a part of. Um, non-professional Slack channels, right? So we have the social channels about people's pets and their food and their weekend and trips and all the rest of it. Um, I think we're pretty good at BDC at kind of celebrating your wins and your misses. I think it's important to normalize both. so a wins channel, um, and a like a better next time channel. And part of all this, it probably feels like over communicating in some way, like, oh, you guys talk a lot. It's like, well, we're a remote company. We were born remote, so pre-COVID, never had a physical office. So you need all these kind of connection points to allow people to opt into. Not everybody participates in every social channel. I don't. Not everybody is active in everything, but this gives them an opportunity to see what other folks are doing and kind of learn from each other. So really creating that space for folks, I think is important. Um, there's a couple other things I can get into, but yeah.
Oh, dang. I already have like 5 tabs open of things that we should do here at Metaplan at least. So I appreciate that for sure. And Justin McCammon, the director of data engineering at Energy Hub, asks, what are the unique challenges that remote data teams face that other remote engineering teams, but let's say remote teams, don't face?
Okay, great question. So I've only led remote data teams, so I have to kind of infer. But part of what makes data teams unique, and maybe that's a good starting point, is that data teams need to um, work across tech. Like it's a people process tech, that kind of framework. So unlike maybe engineering teams, we have to interface with stakeholders all the time. You can't do any data work without talking to the people. So you might be in the UK, and your primary stakeholder, in our parlance, your client, for example, might be in the West Coast. It's very little overlap. Now, there's the kind of problem, or kind of that consideration should have been thought of ahead of time. So before we put somebody from the UK on a client that's in the West Coast, like obviously there's a lot of thought and care that comes to that. But sometimes that's just the way it works. So why is that a challenge? I mean, for obvious kind of time zone reasons, but again, like to do good data work, you need to interface with people a lot more, I would posit, than necessarily to do good, equivalently good engineering work, all else equal. So I think that's unique to data people.
Great. And I think like one follow-up I had was these are the challenge, but like what are the like benefits that remote data teams have that um
Mhm.
in-person data teams don't have?
So such a good question. I think there's a ton. For us, again, kind of speaking for myself, we have access to the world's talent. And I don't mean that kind of figuratively. Like we can, we and also because of our hiring process, it's little plug. It's an anonymized hiring process, which is amazing. We don't accept resumes and all the rest of it. And as a result, you know, I might know your time zone. I think that's part of our onboarding, but that's kind of it. You answer a set of questions. So I don't need to know kind of where you're from and what your background is. You just have to kind of like do the job really well. It turns out that there's a lot of people in the world who do the job really well. So kind of access to the best talent. It also enables a kind of a space for folks who maybe can't access the office, within your 30-mile or kind of 40-kilometer radius or whatever kind of office life is like. And they're able to participate in your work, so you have access to them, but then they kind of have access to you, which I think is really nice. There's kind of maybe tactical benefits, like somebody maybe kind of in the UK and Europe could be performing a set of work, and then when America, or kind of like the West, North America, South America, wake up, there's kind of a set of work ready for them. There's always going to be an overlap. We always want to make sure there's like 3 hours, 4 hours overlap. So you're never like handing it off just via text or kind of Slack, but that work kind of continues throughout. So there are ways to be able to take that benefit and really extend it. So I'd say that's part of the benefit as well. I think to folks, we have some people on the team who I think it's called like digital nomading, which I've never heard of, but once you hear it, you're like, oh, I know what that is. So I think there's some folks who just like want to live somewhere else for a few weeks all the time, and that's cool. just be respectful of your team, of your clients. And the good thing there I found is like, you don't even have to tell people that. Like you say, hey, you should, if you're going to go somewhere that is a different time zone, could you move your meetings around? They're like, oh yeah, I already did that. I talked to my manager. Everything's taken care of. And you're like, okay. People, that kind of adage, like, don't be a jerk. Like people are pretty cool about it. And this enables that. And I think from a quality of life perspective, it would have been a huge win for me 10 years ago. So I can only imagine. Yeah.
Which ties in nicely, speaking of handoffs, to a question from Satvik Ramasetti in the audience of how can we better scope work and requirements to minimize that handover time?
Such a great question. And I don't know that I've nailed it perfectly, but this goes back to kind of being very explicit. And in this case, it would be with documentation. So a few things. One, you need to know who you're talking to. So who's your audience? Are you talking to another developer, for example, that you're handing over code? Are you handing? Is it a ticket that you're writing and you're handing that to a developer? Is it vice versa? So really understanding kind of who your audience is and what kind of where they're at with respect to what you're giving them. I'd say over communicate. If you're going to err on the side of should I spend an extra couple minutes documenting this thing, the answer is yeah, just do it. Think about it later and just do it. And the chances that that's a bad use of your time are very low, in my opinion. So I think like, and then I would say, as I said earlier, around like norms, kind of set norms for how you want to communicate. So that's part of expectation setting. So, here's the outline of the ticket. Like all of our tickets have success criteria, have stakeholders, have ETAs, have, steps, QA steps, whatever it happens to be. And then kind of get into that groove. And it'll take a few passes, a few iterations. And then, open yourself up for feedback. So, cliche to say communication is a two-way street, but kind of course it is. So, because you don't have the social cues of being live or the social cues of like either being live over Zoom or live kind of in person, you have to really, again, be like extra intentional with how you communicate. And I would say like make fewer assumptions. So-and-so knows how this is, so I can skip it. Link to documentation, link to other tickets, for example, if you're writing tickets. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's like really leads on well because you mentioned there like writing tickets and documentation. Like, do you have specific tools? Like, is there a specific tool stack for like not data, but just like how you operationalize your work and your work processes like Brooklyn Data? Do you have to adapt this to clients or is it can it be standard?
That's a great question. At Brooklyn Data, the way that we generally operate organizationally is there's kind of the Brooklyn Data norm. Like here's how we do it, but then we have 13 teams right now, and each team is kind of its own little org. So we try to provide ensure that they have as much autonomy. And actually within teams, because they work on multiple clients, we try to be flexible with clients. It's sometimes clients want things documented in a certain way, so it's really like multiple layers. As a result, yeah, we have best practices and we have kind of here's our default how we do things, but take it and make it your own. So I bet if you asked 3 or 4 different teams, they might have 3 or 4 different ways that they operate. But we use Slack, we use Zoom, we use Confluence for kind of most of our documentation. We invest. So like on the people side, we use Culture Amp for kind of a lot of our people processes, check-ins. Progression.app is what we use for our career framework. And we've integrated a lot of these things into Slack as well. So we have Slack bots that say, okay, it's time to check in with so-and-so. When you give a win to somebody, like in Slack, it can be sent to their progression, so that's used as part of their career framework, which is really cool, kind of self-documenting process of peer feedback. So again, like a lot of documentation, a lot of communication, a lot of systems interconnected, and we're kind of patching them together in a way that like makes sense. And so far, it's working.
I'm curious about, you mentioned 13 teams and each one is a little different. Like, how do the teams vary from each other? Do you have like one Hufflepuff team, one Gryffindor team, or is it mostly, I guess the question is it like a cultural difference and heterogeneity or like a tool stack difference or perhaps both?
Yeah, it's kind of both. Good question. Our teams, so we put a lot of thought into our teams, which makes this a very kind of multi-dimensional question, but one that I think about a lot. In short, a team is roughly, a manager and, call it 5 to 8 reports. Sometimes a little bit less. And teams, they work on a number of clients. Some teams are they'll work on one client, maybe like a big one, and then others work on smaller ones. We try to make sure that teams have kind of time zone alignment. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody's in the same time zone, but we try to have at least a mix so that if there's some folks in kind of Central European time and some folks in Eastern kind of American time, that they have each other to rely on, but also they can rely on folks across team. And then a lot of it is driven by the clients. So if there's a client, if there's 2 or 3 clients that need a lot of kind of data engineering type of work, then you're going to have a team that is more oriented around data engineering. They'll do kind of orchestration or a lot of E&L stuff. And then there might be other teams where their primary focus is around, I don't know, marketing analysis, campaign measurement, website performance, SEO, and that are going to be a little bit more analytics heavy. Kind of different, and there's like, a different culture there, like kind of naturally. And then in terms of the tool set, that is largely driven by our clients. I mean, we make recommendations, but sometimes our clients, especially the big ones, they come in with already a stack, and they need help, but they've already selected the stack, and now we're gonna work in Azure. Okay, so we're gonna do that now, So yeah, does that help answer the question?
It does, and I have a lot of follow-ups, as do people in the audience. Rick Saporta, the VP of Data and Terra. Hey, Rick, asked, could you share more about how you use tools like Culture Amp, and what feedback have you gotten from your employees about liking or not liking tools like this?
Great question. So I should say I'm not the most qualified person at BDC to speak about this stuff, but I'll definitely share my 2 cents. Though, if you do have other questions, would love to take it offline and get the people team in here. I think folks like using tools like Culture Amp because it takes, I mean, compared to what? There's always the question. So what it used to be was a set of Confluence pages and docs and Google Docs and kind of processes that we try to adhere to that aren't really integrated. Like check in at 30 days, and then there's a calendar invite that you have, and it's a little hodgepodge, which I think is how most companies start. And Culture Amp is a really nice way to integrate it all, so it's all in one place, for better or for worse. So I personally like things like Culture Amp and Progression.app. In particular, Progression.app, if you go there, you could see our career framework. It's live. I think we debuted it at the DBT Coalesce conference in one of our talks that folks on the team gave. And I really like those types of tools, because again, like they're transparent, everybody could see them. They're structured in a way that's, I think, very helpful around a lot of these processes. So I think that's really good. With structure comes, downside, like, hey, I want to change this, or this is too convoluted. I have to click on all these buttons to get to a review, or I could just like type it up. It's like super quick. I already know what I want to say. Or I have to fill in these boxes, but they don't necessarily make sense for, if I'm giving feedback to an analyst and I have to input a box around like technical acumen. It's like, well, I really want to fill out a box around stakeholder management, but that box doesn't exist. So now you have to create like a new, like an analyst specific thing. And you could do all this, but again, like with more structure comes more kind of hurdles to overcome to be able to customize it for your use case. So I think, that might be part of the drawback, but that's true of any system. And I feel like, I've used Culture Amp in the past in a couple companies ago, and I seem to like it seemed to work fine. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Ilan. One more follow-up, I think. Dave from David Kim, before we move on to the next question. How do you deal with different levels of stakeholders and how involved they are and want to be in the data project? E.g., some are great at detailing detailed requirements and some write a sentence in Jira.
Yeah. So I don't know if I can give a time zone twist to this, but you could definitely follow up with how does this vary across time zone, I guess. How do we deal with different levels of stakeholders and how involved they are or want to be in a project? With a lot of tact. And there's no way around it. I mean, stakeholders are all made differently, and I think what you have to find is what they're trying to do. Like, what is their overarching goal? They might say, migrate data from A to B, and you might think like, I don't know why you would want me to do that when we just did this other. You might have like a different and they have different context than you do. So it's really about understanding like, well, why do you want to do this? What are the KPIs or the goals that this supports? Why is this the way that we should do it? And you start asking those questions, and I think what you quickly realize is stakeholders didn't know that there's a different way to do it, didn't know that there are alternatives, didn't know that they could punt on this decision for a month to let this other process play out. So it really is, I mean, and none of that's technical. That's just like talking to your stakeholders and really, again, like understanding what it is that they want. Like, what's the question behind the question, I guess. And in terms of writing detailed requirements, and some write a sentence, um, you know, it's about asking, like, an effective method that I've used is kind of asking why. It's like, why do you want to do this? What, how will you know when it's complete? What are the, be like success criteria in particular? I think people struggle with writing. Like, it should run. It's like, that's not a success criteria. You know, like, who's running it? What does it mean to run? Like, really, like, lay out the steps that are required, which sound painful. But when you do that, they quickly realize, like, I don't know what success looks like. Maybe there are errors. Maybe that's okay. Should there not be any errors? What's the type of error that's okay versus an error that's not okay? Um, and then they realize, okay, this is not ready for me to send to you. Like, this ticket is not well scoped, or I need your help in scoping this ticket. So I don't think you have to take kind of what they give you. I think whatever they send you, and if it doesn't pass muster, like, you take it with a grain of salt, and kind of feel free to have that conversation with them. And I would say in a non-accusatory, non-confrontational way, very much asking questions and kind of leading them down a path.
Thanks, Ilan. Great answer. Then onto different topics. How do you deal with data incidents? If teams are across different time zones and some may not be online or even awake when incidents come in?
It's another really good question. In our work, we don't often deal with kind of mission critical, the app's broken, somebody, who's on call. Certainly our clients do, but we don't engage in that type of work often. But I think, it's always important to ask the question of what could lead to such an outage. So instead of how do we solve it when it happens, which is a thing as well, but what would cause this, outage? What observability do we have in place? Kind of, is everybody trained up on it? And setting that expectation, like, I'm going to wake up at my, there's a very critical pipeline running, and we want to keep eyes on it. I'm not going to log on before 8 a.m. my time, but I will at 8 a.m. So I'm setting that expectation, So it's being very clear about stuff like that. If you're managing this project and you do want that time zone coverage because you want, near 24-hour coverage, then it might look like reaching across teams and saying like, hey, is there somebody over there, other side of the world that's available to kind of look at this. So I think what we have the benefit of is being very flexible and fluid. it's definitely exceptional for us to need to be on call 24 hours. But the worst thing you could do is, again, like make assumptions or don't let your stakeholders kind of know what to expect from you. Yeah.
And as a follow-up, I just thought of this. Given that you have these teams that can cover different time zones, do you ever have like someone covering possible incidents overnight who's like maybe it's like a different team covering the team that's working on it during the day, or do you not really need to do that at this stage?
We've never had that, as far as I can remember, where teams like cover for each other. If it has, it's definitely been like one-off. It might happen down the road, and if it does, I'd be curious to hear from y'all, like what your experiences are like, or if you have any best practices. But we haven't really encountered that.
Okay. And then I think the next question we have is, Kevin, you're going to ask this one. Go for it.
Before jumping into that one, Ilana, I have heard of teams that, we work with that meta plane who do kind of rotate uh, responsibility, both on a big, like week to week level, but also on like these windows throughout the day. And uh, hopefully it's infrequent and becomes more and more infrequent. No one likes to 3 a.m. on call, but we have seen a bit of that. Of like, if it happens now, okay, you don't have to fix it, but at least triage it and make a ticket if of yeah.
Right. So a question I would have is, if somebody presumably lacks context because they're on call and they haven't been working with a project for a long time, and they're then on point, Kevin, you kind of answered this, you don't have to solve it, but you have to triage it. Like, are there processes in place that you can, again, like set somebody up to succeed and not make them freak out when they're like, oh, okay, it's happening. It's broken. Also, I don't know this code base, but I'm the human around.
Totally. And that's a awful situation to be in. I like we can't expect everyone to know everything. Of course not. But I think one thing that's more achievable is helping people understand where to go to find out, to learn more. And is it in dbt cloud, right? Are there queries that are standard for use against Snowflake? Is there like a lineage tool to understand what's downstream? But of course, that's dependent on like what you said. How familiar are people with these tools if they're not necessarily living in them day to day? It's a difficult problem, but in that moment, like it sucks, and just making it a little bit better can help quite a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a hard problem.
It's it's difficult, and somewhat related to a question that Gwen Cheney, a partner at Coastal Ventures, asks, which is, how do you manage the time difference decision lag that seems to compound on itself?
Yeah, I'd be curious to unpack what it means to compound. Like, I understand the words compound on itself, but I kind of actually see it as it resolves itself if you ask the right questions, because of like 24-hour feedback loop, I guess. It's important to there's a few things. One is kind of like any decision to be made, there's, pick your favorite framework, but the kind of decisions, the kind of decisions in which the cost of being wrong is low is you should just do that. You should just like do that and then kind of, ask for forgiveness type of a thing. So I would say, especially in this case, if you have to wait 5 hours to get to understand if this is the right thing to do, but between A and B, it doesn't really matter. Like, don't wait and just do it. And that is also a faster way to get feedback. Again, if the cost is low. That's one thing. Another thing is, I would say, like, again, this goes back to being intentional and explicit. Like I said at the very beginning, you have to kind of over communicate and be very clear. And I would say, make it easy for your kind of counterpart to help you arrive at a decision. So not open-ended questions, Like, I'm curious why we made this decision. Like, so that you can take action on my answer. So you really spell it out. Like, if we did it for this reason, here's what I'm going to do next. If we did it for this reason, here's what I'm going to do next. So it does necessitate, again, more communication, more intentionality, being very explicit. But I don't believe that it necessarily has to be the case that everything now is going to be slower and take longer. Certain things will, naturally. That's the way it works. But you can actually take advantage of that. Like I was saying, if it's a small cost decision, you could just do it. The person wakes up, they go online, and something's changed in the world. And sometimes that's a good thing, and they've just saved 5 hours. Sometimes it's not, but they can hopefully undo that change. So yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Love that. It makes so much sense, right? It's like, how high stakes is it and how much buy-in do you need? I mean, the two are kind of correlated. And then asking for like quick one bit of information feedback. Oh yeah, that's great. It makes a
Yeah,
lot of sense. And
yeah.
probably
It's like,
more like, yeah.
I was gonna say, it's like second in order thinking, and it's something that doesn't come naturally. It's like, if you ever play chess, but you know, it's hard to remember a lot of steps ahead, and you really have to think about, like, if I move my rook here, if this person moves, you know. But I'm always happy that I think like multiple steps ahead, even though like it hurts. And it's that type of thinking that I think you need to kind of apply a little bit. Um, and Yeah, that's what I'd say.
We're,
Are we at
we're over
time?
time.
Are we good?
We can go a few minutes over if Alon, you're able to.
Yeah, I can go a few minutes. Absolutely.
I think there's like
Because
one interesting question we could cover before we close. Um, where has been like a really great talent market, which is perhaps quite far from like the Brooklyn data ET time zone, which you'd probably call home, right? I guess to start with, like what is there been somewhere that's maybe surprising, or somewhere that's been great?
Yeah. So far from ET probably excludes everything kind of from PST, like West Coast to East Coast. But we found really good talent kind of up and down as well. Our we have a big hub in the UK, which is I don't know if that's funny or interesting, but kind of around London, just like organically went from one person to two people to now maybe 8 or 9.
Yeah.
So it's become our kind of second largest hub outside of New York. So that's been really fun. And also in Lagos, Nigeria, there we have like another hub there, which is kind of the same time zone as the UK. So those are two hubs, with a smattering of folks kind of in Portugal and Germany, as well. But those are probably the talent markets that, and they've grown organically. It's not like BDC is like running ads there. You know,
Yeah.
Some people hear about us, they apply, they tell their friends. Maybe there's a meetup, and it's always driven by the people on the ground. So we don't have a marketing team, so they just organize meetups, and they get together, and it's fun, and it's great.
Yeah, I mean, having been part of the London DBT community for a long time, it feels like it was like one of the biggest communities in the world in terms of for DBT and analytics engineering. So it feels like it's a good ground for BDC to get talent from, especially like the last couple of meetups I've been to have been like 200, 250 people there, many of whom would be very good candidates. And some of them have indeed been hired. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great to have pockets of folks in similar time zones as well, because then when they kind of wake up in the morning, they have other folks, even if they're not on the same team, they can kind of knowledge share and just like shoot the breeze, with their people who are time zone aligned. So I think that's really nice, as well.
few last questions. One, we linked to the career progression framework, the talk at Coalesce, which was amazing. And do you have any other resources or books on this topic that you really enjoyed?
Oh, that's a great question. Um, Personally, I really like the manager's path. As I've kind of like developed as a manager and as a leader. Um, so that's been a book that I really like. Um, I find a lot of value in locally optimistic kind of discussions and the different channels there. You get to really learn from people who've been through it, and there's a lot of really good content there. I think like if I had to pick one resource, if I was especially as an analyst or an engineer kind of coming up, and to pick one thing, absolutely without fail, join locally optimistic. Go through all the Slack channels. There's a whole bunch of them, and and then just start reading. Just start reading and start meeting people, and I think that's the best. And then eventually buy a book, and you could use that as a reference, and that's fine. But you get a lot more content that's a lot more real time from there. And it's more modern, which I think is important.
Yeah, and I can imagine the speed at which we've seen people publish books, they're like it takes years sometimes to publish a book. Whereas a thread on Locally Optimistic can be so fresh. It can be from, yesterday.
Yeah, and it's pros and cons, right? So like I'm looking at some of the books here, like Klepman's book and Reese and Housley's book are really good as well, like kind of obviously really useful for that kind of like foundational knowledge. And that's what they should be treated as such. And then that could be supplemented with like, well, how are people doing this today on the ground? And then kind of using both, you kind of get both angles, that like broad, like here's where data engineering sits, and and then also here's how I built a roadmap, this quarter. It's like both very useful.
Yeah.
Love that. Both the classics and the Billboard Top 100. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know that Brooklyn Data Co. participates a lot in locally optimistic. Scott writes, I believe, and everything is like totally gold. How can people follow you and also learn more about Brooklyn Data Co.?
Yeah, and by you I mean I take it to mean Brooklyn Data Co. because I personally don't have a presence, but they could follow BDC on I think on LinkedIn. We have a page. They should definitely follow us there. Join Locally Optimistic, which is not a BDC sponsored thing. It's totally just kind of open to everybody. Yeah, I think on LinkedIn is probably the best way. Maybe Twitter as well. And yeah, we're posting events. We're hosting a lot more events. We host a DBT meetup in New York and in other places. And yeah, I think if you find folks, especially from BDC, who are in your geography, you should try to hit them up because they're probably interested in hosting some sort of a local event. We found these like kind of in Atlanta, there's like a meetup, and now there's one in like Nashville and all these different areas. And some are BDC sponsored, some are not BDC sponsored, but there's usually like a BDC person kind of involved in some capacity. So that could be a nice way to also get involved in the community. And yeah.
It sounds like you're hiring as well. I see.
We are. Check out the careers page. It's I think we might be putting some more jobs up. Yeah, it's always up to date. So whatever it says is the latest.
Thanks so much, Ilan. It's been really great to have you on the webinar and for sharing your knowledge about this subject, which actually not so many people have walked this path before, really.
Yeah, David, Kevin, thanks for having me. It's a subject I think it is evolving. We're iterating through it. We think that we do a pretty good job of it, but there's no end in sight. You're just kind of always trying to improve a little bit and then listening to the team and getting that feedback. So yeah, happy to share. And if folks do have questions, you could definitely feel free to reach out to me. And I would love to also connect you to our wonderful people team that spends a lot of time thinking about this and making this process, as good as it can be. So thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Ilan. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Any questions, feedback, please just write it below. and hope to see you next time. Take care, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Bye. See ya.